Now, I know a lot about this.
I definitely got 100 of it.
You know, over. You want Would you let this go? Yeah. Okay. I mean, alright, here's the deal though. I will do review sessions and I'll start maybe in a week or a couple weeks. I'll do a couple IT periods and I will go through anything on that list. On that review packet. I mean, if you come in for that, I'll let you know in advance, but won't be next Monday, probably Monday or not. I'll go over everything. And I'll also take some time if you want. I did this last year at lunch. I took one lunch and I went through as much of the last page as I could. Everybody told you page 11 and 2. We had about 35 people that packed in there, they had to eat their lunch, and I just went through it all. So I'll do that. So just take advantage of that. I know you have 1,000 other things going on, but I will give you time. And also outside of school time, I'll do 1 or 2 review sessions. And I cover a lot. And therefore, I try to narrow it down to, it's still going to be you're kind of a learned guess, but a guess what's coming. So let's go and take your notes out. Did we get to 6th grade? We have Poland, 6th grade, non-regression back. We're going to go pretty quick through this. This is hard for me. I have 1,000 stories and I only tell you a couple. So, did I tell you about the Maginot Line? Yeah. Didn't I just mention this big French defense line? And it's going to be elaborate defense lines here with the idea of forcing Germany to attack through Belgium. It's not a bad idea. And if you go to these fortifications, they are amazing. Now, it's not like a wall. It's just every high ground inside, dug in, is this elaborate defensive line. Elaborate defensive line. They got underground little trains that carry men to garrison in different parts of it. They have turrets, some pop up out of the ground. Nowhere along the French-German border, nowhere was not covered by at least one or many French guns. And so if the Germans tried to attack there, they would get bogged down like a World War I battle, but to the extreme. This is when I went to one fort that's on the Luxembourg border, took a little train. It was hot outside, it was freezing inside. So they tell you, wear pants to warm up. It was cold. It is incredible. They have hospitals, they have barracks. It was unreal. So that's the fortified line. Germany, their original plan, the army, which said, we're not ready to attack France. They were unenthusiastic. This is their plan, knowing they can't attack here with a Maginot Alliance. They would mass everything on the Belgian border, attack through Belgium, and then sweep around like this. Does that seem familiar to anybody? Do you remember the Schlieffen plan? And Hitler was unamused by this, well, the same plan. France and Britain. Britain will eventually have about 200,000 troops they'll send. France has 3 million men in uniform. Their best forces are going to Belgium and stop by there. Pretty good plan. But then a German plane carrying the plans, just carrying the plans, got lost in a storm, January 4th, landed in Belgium by mistake. And now Belgium has plans. And to Britain and France, especially France, we're ready, they're going to do what we thought. Hitler decided to instead do a radical plan by a general by the name of Bonstein to just do a diversion here. The best German forces here is cross from this heavily forested area called the Ardennes. Nobody thought you could go through this, so the French put their weakest forces. And then shoot through here, and then here's the brilliant part. Not go to Paris, but to turn north and cut off all the best forces in Belgium. It's a good plan. Risky, but a good plan. So that's the German plan, and the French don't know it. They think we're ready. So April 46th Krieg ended. Germany attacked and took Norway and Denmark. There were a lot of Nazis in Norway, I'm sure that. There's a lot of spies. Neither side had a real army, or neither Norway or Denmark had a militia. Britain and France tried to stop them. Some German ships, their tiny little navy was seriously hurt, but they conquered them. But now the Sitzkrieg is over. War is coming. And then the Sitzkrieg would formally end May 10th. The Battle of France, or World War I, World War II, Part 1. And it's only 55 days. And you notice those are German troops marching in Paris. The Arc de Triomphe is behind. The French have more men, especially France and the tiny British force combined. France had more and better tanks. Air Force, it was parity, even though Germans had better fighter planes. But somehow France lost. And the reason why is bad communications, they didn't trust radios, and the German tactics totally took them by surprise. So here's what it looked like. Here's the mass of German forces. And they attacked through the Ardennes. France advanced into Belgium. Here's the diversion this way. They also attacked the Netherlands too. One of the biggest tank battles in history is going to happen right here between French and British, or French and German tanks. The French won, but their communications were so bad they pulled back anyways. They didn't trust radios, so they were always behind. And then a place called Sedan, right here, the Germans broke through the forest. This is what Sedan looks like today, right up there. It's a beautiful city. I did not take that. I'm down in Sedan, but looking up the mountains, really pretty. It's a cool place. But here are German forces on the advance, and they broke through and went to the sea. It took them a week. The French were so far behind communications wise, they lost it. And the next thing you know, they got to the English Channel, and the British and French forces are cut off. But most of the German soldiers are still marching. And so there are holes. Here are German tanks and armored vehicles on the rise. And Hitler, ironic, German generals were so upset at this attacking France in 1940 that they almost overthrew him. They almost did a coup. They couldn't decide how to do it and didn't do it. And now Hitler turned out to be right. That was probably the last real chance to remove Hitler from power. Another one of those what ifs in history. But then they got to the sea, and all they had to do was turn and get the little harbors here, and the British and French were cut off. And that's when Hitler made a terrible mistake. Oh, I jumped the gun. At the same time the Battle of France began, the Chamberlain's government collapsed, and Winston Churchill became prime minister. Had nothing to do with the invasion of France, it happened to be on the same day. And Churchill was a backbencher, really unpopular, really unpopular. Nobody liked Churchill after World War I and other things happened with the gold standard. Long story. But he had been warning about Nazi aggression since Hitler took power. And so that got him in the wartime cabinet. And then fortunately for the world, he became prime minister. And he made the snap decision to pull British forces out of Europe. Over 200,000 men. Get them out. By the way, there's a lot of him doing V for victory. Get it? If you turn this around, which I'm not going to do, that is a massive insult in Britain. Or any. Turn this around. That's the equivalent of flipping somebody off. So you go to London, walk into a place and do that, you will be beaten. So don't do that. Let me rephrase it. Some of you, yeah, you do. But the rest of you, don't do it. Don't do it. Yeah. Huh? No, long before that. No one's exactly sure. Some people believe it might be from the 100 Years' War as an insult to the French. We don't know exactly. So, can you catch the accidental wrong date? Yeah, 20 years later, 1940 is supposed to be 1940. The first week of June, 1940, British troops begin to pull back to this little, it's nothing more than a few piers and a jetty at a place called Dunkirk. But Hitler made a horrible mistake. He panicked. He couldn't believe how well their army had done, and he stopped the panzers, saying they need to be refit. Right here. If they would have turned, these were basically undefended at the end of May. And the British forces would have had to surrender. But he said instead, refit at our Air Force, the Luftwaffe, which failed. Once again, we can't go into all details. And over 400,000 troops are going to go to Dunkirk. 200,000 British and a couple 100,000 French. In Britain, they got everything that could float and sent it across the English Channel, manned by Royal Navy Reserve crews. There's a myth that it was civilians. It wasn't civilians, it was Royal Navy Reserve, but any civilian ship, and brought them over. And here's some shots of them waiting to try to get to these ships. The flat bottom ships that can get close or use rowboats or little fishing boats, trying to stop German air Luftwaffe attacks. None of the heavy gear, most of them didn't have their rifles, they had themselves, and that's it. But over 300,000 men made it across. About 150,000 were French, who immediately were sent back to fight for France, and well, but this is huge. Britain could now stay in the war. If they wouldn't have been able to pull those troops out, Britain probably would have scooped for peace. And our entire course of history beat them. So many what ifs at this moment. And you notice the US is even in the war. And this is Hitler's first fatal mistake by allowing this to happen. These are exhausted troops getting back. Here are the rowboats rolling in. This is a little fishing boat. It's the smallest boat that crossed the channel to be used. It's in the Imperial War Museum in London. Cool place. If you get a chance, the Imperial War Museum. Wow, that's a wow place. Even if you're not really in, might think you're not into that kind of military history, it really is that good. And with that, France, morale crushed, their best troops lost in Belgium. The government they almost toppled, chaos, Britain abandoned them. They fought hard for a couple more weeks and then collapsed. Here are a couple of very famous shots. This is one of the more famous pictures. See the just absolute dejection of surrendering and the overjoyous Wehrmacht soldier of the German army. These are colonial troops, the Cameroons, a French colony fighting for France. They had little choice. And they surrendered on the 22nd. The formal surrender would be on the 25th in the same railway car that Germany signed the armistice back in 1918. Here's Hitler pounding its feet in glee after the surrender. And this was a big deal. Now they erased the embarrassment, the humiliation of Versailles. France never has ever gotten over this humiliation of this defeat to this day. And then the British liberated them in 1944. The Americans too, obviously, and Canadians. But still, the British. I think it's kind of funny. I think you'd be happy. But another famous shot, marching by the Arc de Triomphe. That's a really famous, an American so neutral. AP photographers snapped that picture, him sobbing, seeing German troops going through through Paris. And Hitler came for 8 hours and sightseeing. They cleared the streets of Paris, and he went like to the Eiffel Tower. The big thing he wanted to do is go to Napoleon's tomb. He toured Paris. Only time he was ever in Paris, right? They surrendered. Now, France is going to be divided into two. Northern France will be occupied by the German army under military martial rule. And they're going to strip all the resources from France. The southern part will be technically, it's called the free zone, but it's going to be called Vichy France. They're going to do the government in basically a ski resort with a bunch of hotels called Vichy, known for these fast streams and bottled water. Marshal Pétain was one of the heroes of the Battle of Verdun. He would become the leader of this government. And this part you have to add. They openly collaborated with the Germans. They were really bad at the British, but they collaborated with the Germans. And there was this kind of right-wing authoritarian wing that Pétain represented. Much to French embarrassment. So, for example, beginning at the last part of 42, France, the Vichy government, actively participated in the final solution. In 1948, after a horrible war, a new country was created in the Middle East called Israel. And Israel's only ally was France for first about 15 years. Because of the French embarrassment, because Vichy France helping find a solution. Those of you who have looked ahead in history, like you now, might be shocked that the United States was not really an ally of Israel to the late 1960s. Now the US, with this year alone, has given about $18 billion worth of weapons to Israel. We fund the United States pays for what they're doing in Gaza and the West Bank. So that's kind of like one of those. Wow, things change a lot in history. So back to this. Britain's now alone. Churchill vowed to stay in the fight. Now, I put a little like, he did talk peace. And he had to convince the Americans to help, meaning he'll fight. But Hitler made the rational, it's very rational. They would quit. Hitler wanted to sue for peace with Britain, basically allow Britain to keep her colonies and give Hitler a free hand in the war he really wanted to fight against the Soviets. So he just assumed. Now, the German Navy was tiny. They lost a few of they lost a lot of their ships. Attacking Norway. There's no way they could get the 18 miles over the channel. But the British Army was done. Those are home guard men. So militia hastily trained to repel a German attack. That is August of 1940. Do you catch what their rifles are? Yeah. He has an old muzzle-loading flintlock musket, and they're carrying sticks. He has a Tommy. That's an American Tommy gun. They jammed a lot. That's an American Tommy. Yeah. So, Britain stayed in the fight. But Britain had a powerful navy. But the big thing is, too, they had a powerful air force to protect the navy. And so the Battle of Britain would begin August 1940. It would last about a month and a half, and then go on to something else for 6 months. But August 1940. And the plan was the German Air Force, Luftwaffe, knock out the Royal Air Force. And the German Air Force, for various reasons, seemed to be invincible. They had very good fighters, but really short range. Hard to go over Britain. They had small bombers, and their Stuka dive bombers seemed to turn the course of the war. But they were going basically unopposed in much of the fighting against Poland and France. As it turned out, they were really easy to shoot down, incredibly vulnerable. And the battle was going to be a war of attrition. If the Germans, they know they're going to lose a lot of men, but if they can kill enough British fighters and then knock out the factories and air bases, not the Royal Navy, Britain, but Alice. But Britain was really lucky. They were already producing just, in a lot of ways, kind of lucky. I mean, pure luck. They were making 2 really good fighters. So they didn't have to try to come up with something new. This is the Hawker Hurricane, very good fighter. Probably the most famous, or the second most famous fighter plane in the world. You know what this is? Have you ever heard of the Spitfire? The Spitfire. Now, I really like World War II planes. It's just one of the things I really like. I think they're really cool. And if you're somebody who really likes planes, it's one of the most beautiful planes. It is a really cool thing. Now, if you don't find, but I just, wow, they're cool. That's a neat one. But the British also had radar. Now, radar had been invented a decade ago for weather. They couldn't really tell the number of planes, but they could tell the direction they were coming from. And the Germans, remember, they discounted science, kind of Nazi ideology. These women here are reading the radar. These are low-level radar. These are all radar stations. And wherever the Germans attacked, they didn't realize it was radar that was telling the British where to send their fighters. And so the British always had fighter planes pecking away at attrition, knocking them down. The Germans never understood the value of radar. If they should have bombed the radar, they did a couple times. They should have done more of it. Fortunately, they didn't. Also, the British had broken their code. Remember, the British had broken the German World War I code, and they did it again. The Germans were using an encoding machine called the Enigma machine. And it used eventually these four, this has three, but eventually four reels. That every time you typed in the message, it would spin these reels and give basically random letters and symbols for every letter. And it could be thousands of them, and all you had to do is move the reels around and you have a totally different code. The Germans thought it was unbreakable. But Polish intelligence stole it. They had made another one, stole it out of Poland before Poland surrendered and got it to London. And one of the best kept secrets of the war, the British were using these. Didn't work all the time, but they always kind of knew stuff. For example, Churchill would try to warn Stalin, the Germans are going to attack. One of the best kept secrets, I should add, the US Navy wrote the Japanese code. This would be decisive. Germans, it happened twice. The Germans thought, we'll never break our code. We're the smartest in the world. Hubris. So it still almost worked. British fighter planes were knocked down. They were losing pilots. They didn't have enough pilots. But so were the Germans. And if a German plane like these planes were shot down, the pilot's captured. If a British plane is shot down and the pilot survives, once he gets over the shock, you put him back in a plane. And then another fatal mistake by him. A German plane accidentally bombed London. They've been avoiding civilian targets. Yes, they still killed the civilians. But remember, they wanted Britain to super peace. So they didn't want to do terror bombing. Churchill felt this was a change in the war, and he ordered a retaliation. And a small number of long-range British bombers bombed London, a night bombing break. They bombed at night, so they're less vulnerable, but at night you can't hit anything. You just kind of hope you hit the city. It's called area bombing. Didn't do a lot of damage, but humiliated Hitler. Hitler, growing tired of a month and a half of this war of attrition, wanted it over, ordered terror bombing instead. To start bombing civilians. Remember total war. They had done it against Guernica, Warsaw, Rotterdam, and the Netherlands, and now terror bombing. Isn't that a pretty cool picture? That is a Heinkel German bomber, HE-111, and that's taken of it flying over London. That's not the actual plane that actually bombed it, but it's still a pretty cool shot. That's the Thames. One of those, yeah, I gotta show you now. Well, a terrible mistake. This would initiate what the British are going to call the Blitz. And the Germans will use terror bombing, but they had lost so many bombers, they bombed at night. So that meant they could only just try to bomb areas and try to kill and terrify so many civilians as possible. Over the next almost 6 months, 43,000 British civilians would be killed. Almost 140,000 would be wounded. And they bombed other cities after that. Coventry would be one of the most famous. Liverpool, which is a big harbor town. I'm a big Beatles fan. John Lennon, the Beatles, he was born right after a raid. His middle name was Winston. I wonder where they got that name. But if you don't know who John Lennon is, I don't know what to tell you. Here's using the London Underground as a shelter, looking at the wreckage. This was all part of total war. But look at these horrible scenes. Your home was destroyed. That's your cap. This is one of the most famous ones. Parents were killed. But one of the world's founding one. The hell of this one. St. Paul's Cathedral. It's like London's cathedral. There was bombing and fire all the way around it. Somehow it survived. Just one of the miracles of the war. If this dome looks familiar, the US Capitol is an exact copy of it, just smaller. Really kind of weird. You can see St. Paul's like, oh God, that's a Capitol. And it's huge. But the RAF was saved. So Britain survived. And it showed something else. The total work. The plan of total war is you make civilians suffer, so they turn against their leaders, like Churchill. But Churchill stayed in the capital, came out every day. The people saw him. British civilians, after the initial shock, they didn't blame Churchill for the bombing. Who did they blame? Hitler and the Germans. And what did they want? Revenge. One night in 1943, 400 British bombers bombed Hamburg with firebombs. One night, 1943, and killed 43,000 civilians in one night. And that's just good. War, as it turned out, doesn't work the way they thought it would. Oh, sure, people get exhausted and terrified, but they want revenge. It doesn't work, and yet they work the way they think, yet everyone adopts it. Should the Ukraine. And then Hitler, though, with Britain still fighting, would do another fatal mistake. He ordered his army to attack the Soviet Union. They got a couple new allies, Hungary and Romania. They knocked Yugoslavia and Greece out of the war. And now they're going to attack the Soviet Union. Here's an American cartoon. Here's that pack, and there's Stalin, or Hitler stabbing him in the back. Now, this is a map of greater Germany. Remember Lebensraum, living space. But also Hitler was rapidly anti-communist, but also oil. Germany got their oil from the Soviet Union. Hitler hated being dependent upon the Soviet Union for its oil. He's going to capture it. By the way, where is the oil? Okay, this map is from the Congress of Vienna. I'm using it from world history class with the oils. Still one of the biggest oil producing regions of the world, right? Here's the Caucasus Mountains. And two things about this. This desire to control Germany, to control the resources, would be exactly the reason Japan would attack Manchuria and struggle to control the resources. And one more thing. Germany got their oil for the war effort, the Soviet Union. If Germany attacks the Soviet Union, this might shock you. The Soviet Union will quit trading them oil. You believe that? By attacking, they don't knock the Soviets out. They will not have enough oil to fight. Guess what's going to happen? So, Operation Barbarossa. It'll be on the longest day of the year. Soviet roads are mud, are dirt, and so the spring rains turn to mud. So you got to wait for it to dry out. And also, got 18 hours, 20 hours a day. In France, they had paved roads, so the French, they use their roads. Now, the Germans are going to use over 3 million men, over 3,000 tanks. Slightly outnumbering the Soviets, shockingly at first, at least along that front. The Soviets had 1 million men in Siberia. And basically, Leningrad, which is today St. Petersburg, Moscow, and then Ukraine. Hit the Ukraine because that's where the resources are. You think Russia attack. Now, I should add, the Russians had 1 million troops here. Siberia. Remember, Japan attacked Manchuria. There were 2 huge all-out battles between Soviet and Japanese forces in 39 to 40. Soviets won both battles. They're worried about the Japanese attack. And remember, Japan and Germany are allies. So back to this. But here's what you have to get. Germany thought the Soviets would last 6 weeks. They assumed Stalin's government will collapse. They had heard stories about what was going on in the Soviet Union. How Stalin had killed off his rivals, and millions had been starved in the famines of the 1930s caused by Stalin. They're a paper tiger of defeats. Every observer, including every observer in the United States, thought the Soviets can't last 6 weeks. 6 weeks. So, how long 6 weeks? Best case scenario, end of August, right? Best, it's a little bit longer. End of August, they expect the war to be won. The Soviets were completely taken by surprise, despite Churchill's warning. Stalin refused to believe Hitler would be so crazy to attack the Soviet Union, with Britain still in the fight. Over 1,000 Soviet planes were destroyed on the ground before the battle even begun. Here are Soviet forces surrendering, German forces on the advance. They advanced hundreds of miles in days, taking thousands of prisoners, millions of prisoners. Here are more Soviet, German forces on the advance. That's a really famous picture of him throwing a potato masher. Grenade. German Stukas, Soviet Air Force wasn't around, so the Stukas could roam free, at least for a while. This shows how much land they conquered in 6 weeks. Look how much. Now, somebody else did this, but I thought it was so interesting. They superimposed the American Midwest to give you an idea how much land they conquered. Isn't that kind of unreal? Over 2 million Soviet soldiers were captured. Over 2 million died. Anybody want to guess what's going to happen to the Soviet prisoners? Over 2/3 would die by starvation. What Germans would do to the Soviet prisoners would be one of the biggest war crimes. That's saying a lot. I should add, it'd be almost the same number of German prisoners. Soviet camps. Here are more German forces on the march. But by the end of August, the Soviets didn't surrender. They kept fighting. Why does this German tank have the flag on it? Huh? Yeah, so make sure German planes knew who they were. The Soviets did not quit. They lost millions of men and they kept fighting. Following behind German forces were groups of the SS with army help called the Einsatzgruppen. I mentioned these once before. The Einsatzgruppen, they were going to find undesirables. They did this in Poland, but now 4 massive groups of Einsatzgruppen. 4 Einsatzgruppen. And they rounded up undesirable political leaders, teachers, officials that might undermine their rule. Authoritarians always attack teachers, always attack schools. And also Jews. And many, in the first month and a half, many Jews are going to be walked out and killed. This is in Lithuania. This is some Jewish leaders, political prisoners, and that's what is now Belarus. They begin to round them up and follow them. Now, it's a myth in Germany that this was only the SS and not regular German soldiers. That's a lie. A German army helped. But these Einsatzgruppen, while this is going on, this shows total love. Remember that idea if you have an enemy within. And if you're fighting a war to the finish, can they be an enemy within that might lead to dissent and overthrow your country? And now Germany is conquering. Germany has now conquered, by August of 1941, areas that had 90% of the population of Jews in the world. Remember, there are very few Jews in Germany. So that's why this will be called a war of annihilation. And what they would do to each other, it's kind of shocking. 25 to 30 million Soviets. Most civilians. Soviets find out what the Germans did to the areas they took. Remember that video I showed you? We did out of order because I had to be gone. About what the Soviets did to Berlin. So, the big problem though, by August, the Germans had outrun their supply. Most of the transport was still horse. The Germans, the Russians practiced, the Soviets practiced scorched earth. Destroying, like here's destroying a farm. Anything that could be used by the invaders, including all the railroads. And a lot of Germans. Here's a hastily dug grave. So many Germans died. They couldn't get supplies, including, this might be important, winter gear. Up to the front. They did one last gasp that fall. But it's already months after they thought the Soviets would surrender. And this would be called the Battle of Moscow. And it raged from the end of 41 into the beginning of 42. But first fall, then winter. Fall, mud slowed up the German advance, and then all of a sudden winter, it hit them. Well, it went from being 30 degrees to 30 below degrees in a week. German forces froze. Here they are advancing. They didn't have winter gear. They froze to death. Their engines didn't work. They made one last gasp. They got to the gates of Moscow. In fact, they could see the Kremlin, German patrols, but they couldn't take Moscow. There's a big monument in Moscow for this extent of Germany. You could see the Kremlin, but they were stopped. And then remember Siberia? All of a sudden, all those men in Siberia, almost half of them arrived to counterattack. And there they are in winter gear. They're in Siberia, and they counterattack. There was a Soviet spy in Tokyo, and the Soviet spy told them, Japan's not going to attack. Japan decided to attack here. That means they might have to get involved with the United States. So, boom. They stopped the German advance, pushed them back about 50 miles, and the Battle of Moscow would be the first turning point of the war. The Soviet counterattack showed the Germans could be stopped. They can be stopped. Shocking everybody in January 1942. Now, Leningrad is besieged. The Germans have taken almost all of Western Soviet Union. Soviets have lost millions of men and people, but they are in the fight. Yeah. No, of course not.
They did.
Well, they didn't know about Pearl Harbor. They just knew that the Japanese were going to attack the Dutch East Indies, what is now. But they assumed that would probably lead to a war with the US. But the US had already broken their code, so the US knew the Japanese were going to attack somewhere. They just never dreamed they'd be so audacious to attack the Hawaiian Islands. They thought they attacked the US colony in Finland. Who knows? The odds of Hitler's survival would be nil, but yeah, but probably have some kind of trial, war kind of trial. But Hitler would never have been taken. He killed himself, you know. So that's how much they conquered by the end of 41. Look at the area in blue. They conquered this, France, Italy joined in the war. They had all this conquered, and they had conquered here, all the way down to Greece. And don't forget Norway and Denmark. So in 42, Hitler realizing the war is not going to be a long one, needs the oil. So they're going to attack in the south on the Caucasus. I already mentioned that once before. But the problem they had is this. If they attack in the south, their flank will be open on the Don and Volga River, especially the biggest city on the Volga, southern Volga, a place called Stalingrad. Used to be called Tsarvin. It was named after Stalin because he was there in the Russian Civil War. So it's not only an important city for the flank, but it's Stalin's city. Today it's called Volgograd. Called Volgograd. And the Battle of Stalingrad. So it would wage, actually, I put winter of 42, 43. It would actually be from August of 42 until January of 43. Some of the bloody, most horrific fighting of the war. The Germans decided to take the city, and the Soviets kept pouring in troops, and literally it would be building by building, stairway by stairway. Stairways were some of the hardest fighting. Sewer by sewer. By December, the Germans had taken 90% of the city. But they're offensive. Winter had hit, and the Soviets counterattacked. And this counterattack, here's the counterattack right here, would surround Stalingrad and lead to a massive victory. I should have, like the British in the Spitfire, Soviets were already building the best tank of the war, the T-34. Now, it took them a while to really use it effectively, but the Germans had nothing to match it. The Germans, in fact, wouldn't have anything close until 43. So Stalingrad's the second turning. And it showed now the Germans can be decisively beaten. 300,000 Germans had either been killed or taken prisoner. Of the 90,000 prisoners that were taken, Stalin would not release them. Well, in fact, Stalin never released them. They wouldn't be released until 54, a year after Stalin died. And only 10,000 would get out of water as retribution. That's the commander of the Germans on pulse. So, as the German soldiers are being pulled out, a German soldier grabbed an officer out of this rank. And now starving German soldiers, pulled them aside and said, wait till we get to work. You saw what happened in Berlin already. But now Germany has this huge area of occupation, not just the Soviet Union, but Poland, to a lesser degree, Yugoslavia, which erupted in civil war, northern France, but especially the Soviets. Germany had won victory after victory, and they stole resources from where they conquered. So they never fully mobilized for war until 1942. That is Kharkov. Right here in what is now Ukraine, some of the heaviest fighting of the Russian invasion happened there. But Hitler now changed. Hitler now claimed that the whole reason for this war was not communism or the Treaty of Versailles. The whole reason was he had no choice. He had to stop a Jewish conspiracy. A worldwide conspiracy of Jews that were going to take over the world. They were using the Bolsheviks, but the British, the French, and Roosevelt in America to destroy Germany. And Germany is outnumbered and doesn't stand much of a chance, but they had no choice but to save civilization from this Jewish conspiracy. Now, that is not at all the reason that the war was started, but he tried to turn it into that. But the important thing here is he's saying, we're fighting everybody. That means we might lose. That means we don't have much of a chance to win this war. We have to do everything we can to defeat the Jews down. See where this is going. See where this is going. Remember concentration camps. Well, they established concentration camps in every place they occupied, over 3,000. But it started as the terror for political prisoners, like in Dachau right here, started evolving into work camps. There they're mining bauxite, which is necessary for aluminum. Well, many of these concentration camps, over 1,000 of them, became 100% just slave labor camps. And every concentration camp, German industrialists would build a factory right next to it to start building. So these are slave laborers from France, slave laborers from the East. Concentration camp victims had to wear some kind of identifier, triangle, square, depending on where they're from. This is the most famous, a yellow Star of David, from Jewish concentration camp victim, and slave laborers. But don't you remember when I told you about slavery in factories when I talked about the United States, how slaves break stuff to fight back? German equipment was notoriously unreliable because of slave labor, because they fought back, risking torture and death, and many of them were to help win the war. Jewish and other concentration camp victims and other victims just fought back time after time. But this is the Auschwitz concentration camp. There was an old brick Polish army barracks. If you go there, you can go through the horrible cells and the rooms where they kept. It's also an incredible museum. And remember Art by Montfree, Work Will Make You Free? Well, inmates built this, and I'm so glad this has been saved and preserved. There's 1,000 ways to fight back. Little ways, but they add up. Fight back against tyranny. Do you see it? I took this picture. I took it so you can see the letters of Arbeit. Do you see it? The B's upside down. It's a little thing, but we'll put the B in upside down. I won't do what you tell me. Do it wrong. On purpose. I love that one because that's pretty noticeable. That's not like inside of a wheel of a tank. So most of Auschwitz are going to be these work camps of concentration. In the areas where there's large Jewish population, they concentrated them into what's called ghettos, kind of a medieval name for areas of cities with Jews. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there and then also at the there. Most of those came from Berkeley Mall, down Camp West. And the eyeglasses, it's pretty, it's hard. Yeah. It's like especially short things. The concentration camps. Yeah. Experiments on cute children, experiment like that. I don't want to go into too many details about Pretty unfair. All these dots are areas where there were ghettos. And the big cities are all rounded up, walled off. The average calorie intake in these ghettos were between 300 and 400 calories a day, which is below starvation. And the plan was to work them to death. They were administered by mostly Jewish guards on soldier commando. Got a little bit more food, hoping for survival. This kind of terror leads to horrible decisions. Horrible decisions I didn't want to think about. Yeah.
That since like they were allowed mineral items like instruments and things, that Germany would take photos of them like using the instruments and like using things and like try and put a positive spin on the ghettos, saying, look,
Oh, yeah.
they're like making music with their people. The ghettos are so cool.
Yeah. And a lot of times, and inside the ghetto, they would actually fight back and have orchestras and try to keep education going. But yeah, they would try to use propaganda to say they're not that bad. In fact, they would argue we're doing it for their protection. So we're actually, yeah, but you're exactly right. But then the final solution was Jewish question. So going into 42, the war didn't go the way they thought. The war was going to their point of view badly. They had conquered much of Europe. Yet the Germans knew the clock's against us. And don't forget, we just said there's Hitler's now saying this massive Jewish conspiracy. And can we allow a fight to the finish against the rest of the world, total war with an enemy within, remember Armenia. So the decision was made to do what with this enemy within, because we can't. Exterminate. Some gas, a little over half are going to be shot. This, not just Jews, but other undesirables, like the Roma people, or any people with beliefs, or a couple certain religions, like Jehovah's Witnesses, but others. Now, in area controlled by the Soviet Union in 41, so areas they conquered after Barbarossa, they just beat up the ISIL. And these are some of the most horrific groups. They heavily recruited from areas that they liberated from Russia, basically saying, you want better food? And these killed millions of Jews. So they would just line them up in the massacre sites. I cut this off for obvious reasons. Strip them naked, shoot them, next row come in, shoot them, next row, shoot them. Just piled on top of each other. All those thoughts are mass graves. Millions. My niece and nephews in Lithuania. I cut that off. And basically, these groups of Einstein's groupings were the most horrible people either you can imagine or just constantly drunk. You know, the way that we get through this, just constantly. And this is in Ukraine, they marched off, in a quarter. For Western Poland and the rest of the area they conquered, they decided to establish death camps and use the railroads to funnel them there. So the base population of those areas were in Western Poland. So they were moved from the ghetto right there and taken to 5 death camps. For example, at Sobibor, they rioted and 100 escaped. They tried in Treblinka and Belzec and a few escaped. They fought back. In Warsaw, they revolted and tried. They fought back. We don't have time to go over detail, but I want to make sure I have to say that. Yeah. Oh. Well, you got a reading. I gave you a reading on the atomic bomb. No, they just have to help you. Really help you. Tomorrow, we quickly do Pearl Harbor. Not much, just a few little things about the war. And then I'll kind of finish up with a few things about the atomic bomb tomorrow. If you're not going to be here, I will record it, I promise. It'll be really exciting. You what?
It was my total station for like 7 years. It recently moved over to like season. It was
So you have a lot of fiction.
Should I still do one? I have a poster for documentary.